All right, it is 7:05. So personally, we want to thank all of you for joining us here on our first live stream of Seattle Police Accountability Group. So we're basically here to educate people and shed light on the current accountability system in order to point out its structural and systemic flaws. Our ultimate goal is to create a system of community oversight of whatever system of policing that our community has reimagined. Your presenters will be myself, Daniel, Braxton, and Julie. So we can go to the next slide. So just some quick notes again. We have taken away the ability for you guys to unmute yourself, just so there's no disturbances throughout the presentation. But yeah, so basically what's going to happen throughout this whole presentation is we're going to go over a brief history of the police accountability in Seattle and these related accountability partners. We're going to go over these 3 accountability bodies displayed here on the screen. It is the Office of Police Accountability, or OPA, the Community Police Commission, or the CPC, and the Office of Inspector General for Public Safety, or OIG. So we're going to be discussing the who, meaning who is involved, and what did the body look like, or the organization look like. The what is their mission, what do they actually do, and the why. Why is this body important, or why is it unique and ineffective or effective? Something just to note, we are doing this in order to shed some light on the accountability system, and there is no way that we can cover everything in one live stream. There are so many other bodies, other organizations, and policy documents that are extremely important that we just won't be able to cover today. However, we do plan on having a lot more live streams in the future, so just look out for that on any of our social medias. We'll be posting a lot more about it. And then towards the end, we're going to tie everything back together with an analogy for the accountability system and what we can do moving forward. And it looks like we have another person messing around, but we'll get on that. Sorry, apologize for that. Then we'll have some time for question and answer. If questions do arise during the presentation, you can always post them in the chat and we'll get to them during our question and answer portion.
Next slide, please. All right. So basically, before we go into detail about the different accountability bodies, it's important to look at a brief timeline of how the accountability system came to be, and what laid the framework for these different accountability bodies creation. So we're going to go back to December of 2010, looking at the left side of the timeline, when the ACLU, as well as 34 other community organizations, wrote to the Department of Justice on Seattle Police Department's excessive use of force. Fast forwarding 1 year to December of 2011, that's when we see that the Department of Justice actually completes their investigation, finding that Seattle Police Department had an excessive use of force and a pattern of practice of constitutional violations. Going forward 1 more year into 2012, this is when the historic consent decree was signed, and this laid the groundwork for a lot of the reforms towards police servicing and what policing in Seattle looks like. In 2013, this is when the Community Police Commission, otherwise known as the CPC, was created to promote greater transparency and public understanding of SPD. So basically, the CPC served as the voice of the community. It was supposed to bridge the gap between the people and the police. Going forward 1 more year in 2014, amidst a police chief scandal, when the acting police chief overturned 7 controversial disciplinary decisions that were taken by the different accountability bodies and decided to let the officers off the hook. To give an example of what those different decisions or police misconduct cases looked like, they decided to overturn a 1-day suspension of a police officer who threatened and harassed a reporter from the stranger after that reporter was caught taking photos of the police detaining another subject in a King County, in a Seattle metro station. So basically that police officer was threatening to harm an individual for exercising their own constitutional rights. Going forward into 2017, this is when the historic Police Accountability Ordinance was passed. And the Police Accountability Ordinance, what it did was it created the OIG, or the Office of Inspector General, as well as strengthen the powers of the CPC and the OPA. But what this presentation is going to look into is to see how much power were these accountability bodies actually given to hold the police accountable.
Okay, awesome. So the first accountability partner that we'll be going into is the Office of Police Accountability, or the OPA, which is an oversight agency made up of 26 personnel. It's civilian-led and composed of 9 sworn officers, 12 civilians, and 2 deputy directors, and then 1 main director. So that's kind of who, who makes up this organization. And now the what. So OPA's mission is to ensure the actions of Seattle Police Department employees comply with law and policy, and they do this through conducting investigations and recommending improvements to policies and training. So the OPA investigates officer misconduct, often through individual complaints that civilians make, and then they give those recommendations to the chief of police, who then implements these recommendations at their own discretion. And the chief must report back to the OPA detailing the status of these recommendations. And then these recommendations can be individual discipline or termination recommendations for individual officers, or it can be broader changes to SPD policy or training. So that's kind of the what do they do? Now the why. So the first part of this is why is this body unique? So it's unique in that it was the first accountability body. It was established in 1992. It was called the Office of Professional Accountability when it was first created, and it investigates individual complaints against officers. As I previously had mentioned. It is administratively tied to SPD, so it has access to a lot of its materials in order to be conducting these investigations. And then on our next slide, we're going to go into whether or not the OPA is effective. So if we go on to our next slide. Okay, perfect. So there are a lot of, so basically, long story short, this is really complicated, but long story short, no, the OPA is not effective. So there are countless issues with the OPA. We could do a whole 1-hour live stream on all the different issues with this particular accountability body, but we're going to highlight a few structural issues. So we've kind of created this little graphic to show how different factors, some internal to the OPA and some external to the OPA, hinder its ability to hold officers accountable at all stages of the investigation. From when a complaint is first filed to the end when a recommendation is made. And so to begin with, an overwhelming majority of OPA complaints don't make it to an actual investigation. Which, isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself, because maybe not necessarily every single complaint needs to be, investigated fully, but there are a bunch of pretty concerning ways that you can that the OPA and the larger system can circumvent investigating these complaints. So I'm going to go over 3. So the first one is supervisor action. Which basically this happens, this is like when there's a minor, what the OPA finds is a minor policy violation. It could be addressed by requesting training, communication, or coaching by the employee's supervisor. So basically, instead of investigating, the OPA just hands off this complaint to whoever's in charge of the particular employee and says, kind of deal with this as you see fit. The issue is that, what constitutes a minor policy violation is pretty subjective, and there has been concern that in some of these cases, the complaint should have actually been investigated. So that's the first one, is supervisor action. The second one is what is known as an expedited investigation, which alleges a policy violation where the OPA believes it can issue findings based on its preliminary investigation and without interviewing the involved employee. So it technically is an investigation, but they really just use very preliminary investigation. And what's important in this case is that no discipline can result from this outcome, which is pretty alarming that many complaints can result in no discipline because of this expedited investigation. And then finally, the third one is when the cases are filed as mediation. So in recent years, the protocol of mediation has been abused as an excuse not to open formal investigations into police conduct. So mediation has to be agreed upon by both parties, so both the complainant and the officer have to agree to mediate. However, importantly, once mediation is accepted just by the officer, opening an investigation is no longer an option. So even if the person who filed the OPA complaint does not want to mediate, as soon as the officer agrees to it, opening an investigation is no longer an option. So clearly there is a lot of ways that you can circumvent an actual investigation. But if a complaint does result in an investigation, the contract between the City of Seattle and the police union poses multiple obstacles. So this particular contract is the contract that was negotiated between the City of Seattle and the Seattle Police Officers Guild, or SPOG, the police union. And it poses a lot of issues when it comes to accountability. So to begin with, although the OPA does have subpoena power, so they can subpoena witnesses, this power has been limited by this contract with respect to employees and their personal records. So although they do have subpoena power, it is limited. So maybe that might pose an issue to gathering information. In addition, the contract makes it extremely difficult to extend the 180-day deadline that OPA investigations have to follow. So OPA investigations have to happen within 180 days, and the contract makes it extremely difficult to extend that. And so OPA officials have reported rushing investigations because they knew that they would not be granted more time. Even if an investigation can be completed, investigations rarely end in termination. So even if the contract doesn't pose an issue, even if the investigation actually begins, even for grave offenses, it is, alarmingly, there isn't that much that the OPA actually recommends as far as terminations. A lot of times they recommend looking back at the policy instead of actually recommending punishment for offenses. Again, even in cases of grave offenses. And then finally, if an investigation is completed and a recommendation is made, OPA only has the power to make recommendations to the chief of police, who can then decide whether or not to implement these recommendations. Again, this isn't necessarily OPA's fault, but it is a structural issue that needs to be addressed. So that's kind of a few of the main issues along the investigation process line that are very important to address. And then if we move on to the next slide, perfect. Okay, so we also wanted to highlight a really big structural flaw with OPA. Aside from everything that I said, there is one huge structural flaw. So this is the organizational chart of the OPA that you can see here. There's a lot of different people, a lot of different bodies, and we're going to be focusing on this main section in the middle, which is the investigative body, the people actually doing investigations. So if we could click to the next slide. Okay, so as we've 9 out of the 11 investigators, which are in red, are what is called sworn investigators, which means basically that they are SPD officers. The people investigating these complaints a lot of them, a majority of them, are SPD officers, which obviously poses a huge conflict of interest when officers are investigating other officers. Importantly, these sworn officers are always rotating, and so they're only serving a few years in the OPA and then going back to the force, to SPD. So they would be investigating their future coworkers or bosses. It's also important to highlight, as we have on the side, that only sworn investigators can investigate police management personnel. So that means any of the higher ups, any of the management have to, if there's a complaint against them, it has to be investigated by a sworn investigator or a police officer, as well as any complaints that may lead to termination or stigmatizing the career of an officer. This is especially problematic because it can be argued that any complaint can lead to termination. If you think about it, like, have you recently seen or heard of any police misconduct during, the past couple months during these protests? And do you believe that this misconduct could or should result in termination? And if you believe it should, then that will most likely be investigated by a fellow police officer. So we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So as you all probably thought to yourselves, there have been countless instances of police brutality throughout these past few months in response to peaceful protests. The OPA has received 18,000 email complaints in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And the fact that these complaints will most likely be investigated by those very same cops' coworkers is clearly a huge flaw in the accountability system and has led to a complete absence of accountability. So for example, in the instance of the police officer pepper spraying a very young child, the OPA just recently found that the use of pepper spray was consistent with department policy and that the officer didn't see the child. So in this case where, something horrible happened to a child, no one is being held accountable. And that's a huge structural issue that starts with the OPA. So that's a bit about the OPA. We will move on to our next accountability body.
All right, so now we're going to focus on the OIG, or the Office of Inspector General. And what the OIG is, it's an office comprised of nine different civilian personnel, and it is headed by the Deputy Inspector General, who's pictured on the bottom, Lisa Judge. And the goal of the OIG is to focus on systemic oversight of Seattle Police Department, the OPA, as well as its partners, such as the police unions and the mayor and city council. And they do this in three different ways. First, they review and systemically audit SPD and OPA. Secondly, they oversee OPA complaint handling, as well as any complaints that are being made towards the OPA. And finally, they are tasked with creating and improving policy and practice alongside SPD's partners. Now, before we go any further, it's just important to mention that the OIG has only been formally in existence for about 2 years. And before its existence, these tasks were given to the OPA head lead chief auditor. And so with that being said, it's hard to look at the OIG's historic effect on accountability. So we're just going to focus on their most recent works. Next slide. So one piece of work that we decided to look at by the OIG was its review and assessment of the Force Review Board. And for those who are unaware of what the Force Review Board is, it is a committee comprised of 18 police officers who are tasked with looking at different acts of police use of force and just judging whether they're justified and within policy, similar to the OPA, but more specified, and then making more recommendations on that fact. We're not really going to look into the Force Review Board too much, but like I said, it's completely comprised of police officers. So this is also another example of the police policing themselves. So looking at this graphic in the center, you see that it depicts what is the result of 294 different recommendations that were given by the Force Review Board towards the Seattle Police Department. 84 of these recommendations were not implemented either due to disagreements or for various reasons, but that large green chunk shows the recommendations that were implemented, 210 of them, or 71%. When we're looking at this, when we're looking at the OIG's assessment, one thing that they pointed out that is extremely alarming and important is that the Seattle Police Department doesn't actually have a formal way to track the implementation of these recommendations. And so to give an example of why that's problematic, let's say that the Force Review Board deems that it's no longer okay to, within policy, to pepper spray children, for example. Well, Seattle's police department has 5 different precincts. So let's say that only one of the 5 precincts begins to talk about implementing this recommendation, and they don't have any actual proof of doing so. This recommendation would still count as being fully implemented, even though the 4 other precincts, we have no clue, no idea where they stand with the change in policy, whether they agree to it, and whether they're actively making sure that it is enforced. So we'll go on to the next slide. All right. So when we're looking at the OIG, whose goal, like I said, is to look at is to systemically oversee the Seattle Police Department as well as the OPA, it's not only important to look at the work that they have done, but the work that they have failed to do. And one systemic problem that extends beyond Seattle or Washington, and it's a national problem plaguing the country, is racially biased policing. So to further elaborate on this, we have 2 images here. The image on the left shows the demographic makeup of Seattle. We see that the white population makes up about 65%. Blacks and African Americans make up a little less than 7%. Asians make up 15%, and the multiracial, Hispanic, Latino, and other races that don't fall into any of these categories make up about 15% as well. The pie chart on the right shows the demographic of who is usually getting force used on them by police. The largest chunk on the right of 40% is the white population, which basically means that 60% of the time an officer is using force, it is towards a person of color, even though people of color only make up 35% of Seattle's demographic. And to expand on this, the Black population, like I said before, only makes up 7% of Seattle's population, but they still account for 32% of cases where an officer used force. And this number actually rises to 36% in relation to officer-involved shooting. So with this clearly being a systemic problem that is not being addressed by, like I said, by nationally, but it is not being addressed by the OIG yet. And they have not really taken any formal steps or public action in terms of addressing the need to address such a systemic problem that's the case of the reason why all these protests are happening currently and why they have been for such a long time. So we'll go to the next slide. So another aspect that, before I go into another systemic flaw with the OIG and where they lack to actually address the problem, I'm going to talk about 3 separate cases that have occurred in Seattle. So first is the case of Charlena Lyles. Back in 2017, a pregnant Charlena Lyles called the Seattle Police Department to report a suspected robbery in her own home. When the police arrived, they noticed 2 things. First, they state that Charlena Lyles is under a state of mental duress. She's currently going through a mental crisis. And secondly, partly through the investigation, they say that she was brandishing a knife. By the end of that interaction, the police had shot and killed Charlena Lyles, even though she is, like I said, a 100-pound pregnant woman who was shot by 2 police officers who stand well over 6 feet. And so we just have to ask ourselves, is that acceptable? And it doesn't really matter how we feel about it, because the OPA themselves had found that Charlena Lyles' case and her murder was actually within policy, and the shooting and killing of Charlena was justified. Fast forward to May of 2019, the case of Ryan Smith, when the 4 police officers are responding to a domestic violence call in South Queen Anne. When they approach the apartment, they begin to kick down the apartment door, and they see a heavily inebriated Ryan Smith standing in the hallway, holding a knife that is 2.5 inches long. So in other words, it's half the length of a pencil. After an autopsy was done, and they found that Ryan Smith was about 5 times the legal limit for his blood alcohol content level. So like I said, heavily inebriated. And even in this case, in the body cam footage, you can see that Ryan Smith steps, or some could argue even stumbles towards the police officer. And this results in 2 of the 4 policemen shooting him over 7 times and thus killing him. Once again, this was a case that has been found to be justified and within policy. The third case I'd like to mention that is not pictured here is the instance of Terry Caver in May of 2020, this year. A 911 call came in that a man was walking around holding a knife and that the caller felt threatened by it. More than five police officers, as well as a K-9 unit, respond to this call, and this is when they get to Terry Caver. And they see, and it's also important to mention that Terry Caver was also suffering from mental illness. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia a few years before, and he was suffering from a traumatic mental episode during the case. When the police arrive on the scene, they begin to circle and surround Terry Caver, and after tasing him, he turns, and it's unclear whether he turned from just on his own accord or because he was convulsing from being tased. But regardless, the police saw that as an act of aggression and shot Terry Caver more than 10 times, killing him at the scene. So one thing that all three of these cases have in common is that they all were armed with knives. And it's important to note that these are 3 deaths that have happened in Washington alone, or in Seattle alone, from someone wielding a knife. But when you look at countries like Britain, who have not seen a single death from the police shooting someone who's armed with a knife in over 30 years, we have to ask ourselves, why is it okay, and why can it happen here when it clearly is possible to prevent shooting and killing someone? Secondly, we also have to address how SPD responds to those who are suffering from mental illness or going through a mental episode or mental crisis during that point in time. These are, just like I said, they're episodes. They're not indicative of someone's entire life. They're moments in their life, and the fate of their life should not rest on these few moments. But yet the OIG themselves have not addressed these problems. They have not addressed how SPD responds to killing. They have not addressed the fact that there is no policy by the SPD on how to respond to people armed with knives. But they have also not addressed how SPD responds to those who are suffering from mental illness and going through a mental episode, or in Ryan Smith's case, who are heavily inebriated. And it's just important to look at that fact. But going back to what the OIG has stated and what they have done, I'd like to just go to the next slide. So the OIG has conducted a Sentinel event review in regards to SPD's response to the current George Floyd protest. And the response is lukewarm at best. So these quotes on the right of your screen are taken directly from the report. And there isn't much in there in terms of actually holding police accountable. The first quote is the OIG highlighting the need to closely review how and whether senior level command is held accountable for the decision making and authorizing force in determining overall tactics. Through reading the entire report, that was kind of the beginning and end of that conversation. But what is interesting is that the OIG did bring up the fact that banning a tool, or in this case, certain crowd control weapons, is not equivalent to taking away the triggering event. Or in other words, that banning these crowd control weapons that's not the key to safety. That's not what's going to make these protests be able to continue peacefully. Instead, what it will do is it will force SPD to respond to the same situations with only their batons and their firearms. So what the OIG, or the Inspector General, has basically been saying is that the issue is not with the weapons, but the issue is with training, and the issue is with policy. And there is some merit to that argument, but throughout the entire Sentinel event review, there still has yet to be a mention of whether officers are going to be held accountable when they're clearly acting outside of policy, when they're clearly endangering the public safety and possibly creating more hostile situations from their disregard of their training, from the disregard of their policy. And this is evident from, like what Julie said earlier, over 18,000 complaints in the last 5 months have been filed, but the OIG has not addressed this in their own Sentinel event review. So overall, what this leads me to believe, and I'm not sure if I painted this picture for you as well, but if we could go to the next slide, we found that the OIG is basically a soft bark with no bite. And it's for a multitude of reasons. And some are not entirely up to the OIG. Some are because of the different contracts, the police union contracts, and the accountability system. But like I said, the OIG is only comprised of 9 different people. So 9 people are expected to give efficient and thorough review of not just the OPA, the Office of Professional or Police Accountability, but of the entire SPD police force, as well as its partners, which are the police unions, the mayor, city council, and their actions towards policing in Seattle. But let's say that the OIG grows 10 times overnight, and they actually have the power to conduct these thorough investigations. Well, we found that from the investigations, reviews, and assessments that they have completed, they take a consistently neutral stance. There isn't really a sense of urgency that the OIG conveys in the work that they do. What we found is that the OIG will tend to say things like, we could possibly benefit from this, or it might help in some situations if maybe we do this or that. But that's not what we need from an accountability system. If from an accountability system, we expect them to hold police accountable and to demand changes that are necessary and that are needed, because if without them, they're possibly endangering other people's lives, and they're possibly costing up people their lives. But yet the OIG has not taken any formal stances as such. But let's say that not only has the OIG grown 10 times in size, but they also start taking that powerful stance. They're just as riled up from these last protests, and they say, you know what, I want to be a part of this change that everyone is talking about, that everyone is fighting for. And they do start taking these stances. Well, as great as it is to hear it, we found that the OIG doesn't really have much power to actually enforce these changes. Just like the OPA, they're purely advisory, and the most that they can do is issue recommendations, but there is nothing that's actually making the police implement these recommendations. There's nothing that's keeping the police from ignoring what the OIG is saying, and there's no way to hold them accountable for doing as such. So that's my overall synopsis of the Office of Inspector General.
Okay, so I'll be going over the Community Police Commission, also known as the CPC. The CPC is made up of 21 commissioners. 7 are appointed by the mayor, 7 are appointed by the city council, and 7 are appointed by the CPC themselves. What is important is that all commissioners are carefully selected to best represent Seattle's diverse demographics and communities, with a focus on minority groups. They've broken up into several work groups. The current work groups are the Police Accountability and State Legislative Agenda Work Group and the Defund and Reinvest Work Group. So work groups are pretty fluid, and they often merge, or new ones can arise in order to assess and work on fixing more current issues. So for the what, the mission of the Seattle CPC is to listen to, amplify, and build common ground among communities affected by policing in Seattle. And they hope to align our communities and Seattle's police in shared goals of safety, respect, and accountability. The main function of the CPC is to identify any problematic laws, policies, or practices, and provide recommendations for appropriate police reform. Importantly, these are recommendations which SPD can accept, decline, or partially implement at their discretion. The CPC holds regular meetings in order to discuss policing in Seattle and make recommendations. So for the why, first, why was this body created? Why is it unique? This body was created by the consent decree to ensure community participation in the system of policing in Seattle. The CPC is completely separate from SPD, physically and administratively, so they are more neutral and not as many conflict of interest as the OPA, for example. The second part, is it effective? Why or why not? The answer is pretty complicated, but overall, no, not really effective. To begin with, although the CPC is separate from SPD, it is not completely immune to political interference. Because 7 commissioners are appointed by the mayor, and then 7 are appointed by the city council, there is some political pressure to align with the views of these offices. The CPC has also been criticized for its lack of community input. Although the meetings are open to the public, they are not open to public comment, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense considering they're supposed to amplify community voices. The work group meetings are held behind closed doors, and important discussions are often not open to the public either. Another issue that seems to be reoccurring in all these accountability bodies, but especially with the CPC, since it is administratively separate from SPD, is that they are currently denied access to SPD material. And basically, like, their access is public access, so anyone can get it. It's not like how the OPA or the OIG has it, where they have subpoena power, because the CPC doesn't. Finally, the CPC is only an advisory body, so their recommendations are not enforceable. We can go to the next slide. So even when the CPC does take firm stances or make recommendations to the city, they're often ignored. And we will specifically examine times the CPC has been ignored in relation to the police contracts, or CBAs, which was previously discussed. And how these contracts rolled back accountability measures and made the city fall out of compliance with the consent decree. So in 2018, the CPC held a unanimous vote to urge the city council to reject the new contract between SPOG, the police union, and the city, as it rolled back important accountability measures set up in the 2017 accountability laws and would throw the city out of compliance with the consent decree. The CPC was ignored and the contract was approved by the council. And then indeed, in May 2019, a federal judge ruled that Seattle was out of compliance with the consent decree and ordered the city to work with the CPC and other stakeholders to come up with a plan to put the city back in compliance. Despite this mandate, the city did not reach out to the CPC immediately. And when the city finally reached out in June, Mayor Durkin informed the commission co-chairs that she had chosen a group of consultants from a Chicago-based 21CP Solutions to assess Seattle's accountability system, ignoring the mandate to work with the CPC and other community stakeholders. Something important to note here is that the 21CP Solutions group is actually a group of former police officers. In multiple instances throughout July and August of 2019, the CPC urged the city to change course and work with the community groups, each time being ignored by the mayor's office and the city. In December 2019, the mayor's consultants completed their assessment, concluding that Seattle's disciplinary system is working as intended, but identifying some areas for improvement. The city did not respond to parts of the court's order to work with the commission and other stakeholders. This is just one specific situation where the city ignored the CPC, but it honestly has happened since the CPC's establishment back in 2013.
All right, so we're also going to talk about a specific instance of when the entire accountability system had basically acted in unison, because for the most part, they all act on different channels and under their own accord. So as many of you, as maybe if you've also been to these protests, you know that Seattle had banned the use of tear gas, but we're going to talk about that timeline and what that looked like. So in June 5th of 2020, earlier this summer, the OIG, OPA, and CPC, so all the three main accountability bodies, issued a joint recommendation to ban Seattle Police Department's use of tear gas. That very same day, Chief Best and Mayor Durkin issued a 30-day ban on tear gas. So it seemed like, you know, obviously the war is not over, but it seemed like a small victory. At least we could, you know, expect those words to be, and those promises to be kept. Well, you fast forward 48 hours and onto June 7th of 2020, and this is when SPD, or the Seattle Police Department, continued to deploy tear gas on protesters, just 2 days after the mayor and the police chief had promised not to use tear gas anymore. But then we have to look at the effect of what ended up happening to the city of Seattle and what ended up happening to the mayor and police chief best for breaking that promise. And it's listed here right between June 7th and June 15th. And basically what I'm saying, nothing. Nothing happened. And it kind of just is a perfect example of the way our Seattle's accountability system is currently set up. We have these different bodies that, you know, at times they truly want to fight for us, and they truly want to, represent what the people are, speaking for and what they're asking for. But even in those instances, the mayor, the police, city council, they don't have to listen to us. And they showed that in that example. And it wasn't until June 15th of 2020, when the city council finally bans the use of tear gas, when we could actually expect that to stop. And so far it has.
Okay, awesome. So now that we've gone over these accountability bodies, it's kind of becoming hopefully pretty clear that although the accountability system is relatively ineffective, it is very complicated. There's a lot of different bodies, and we've just covered 3 here, but there's a lot more. So in order to kind of make things a bit more simple, we've kind of created a bit of an analogy for the system of police accountability that you could use to explain to your friend in just a few minutes. You wouldn't have to take the whole 40 that we've taken. So obviously with any analogy, you're going to be losing a bit of nuance, but this is as close as we could get it. So if we could get just one more click. Got a little animation going, there we go. So imagine SPD is a bully, which maybe you don't have to imagine, seeing is what's been happening, but SPD is a school bully who has been bullying you in one of your classes. Your logical solution would be to go to the school counselor, since she's supposed to be there to listen and investigate cases of bullying and make proper recommendations for the discipline of the student who is bullying you. The problem is the counselor is the bully's mom. And so, she probably will not be actually recommending discipline for her own child. In this case, as you can see, the counselor is the OPA, who is supposed to be responsible for disciplining SPD, but often doesn't because of the major conflict of interest that arises from being staffed by officers. Okay, so say you cannot go to the counselor in this case. What you can do is maybe try to go to the teacher. He's in the class with the rest of the students whenever this bullying happens, and he feels very sympathetic as he personally sees how this bully is affecting his students, how this bully is affecting his classroom. He can try his best to get the school administration to discipline the student, but at the end of the day, he isn't part of the administration. He's just a teacher, and he doesn't have the power to expel or suspend a student. He has to work within the confines of the school system, and if he sticks his neck out too far for you, he risks being fired. So in this case, the teacher would represent the CPC, who they are members of the community, and they have seen and experienced police brutality firsthand, but unfortunately they do not have the power to do anything significant about it. And they have to work within the confines of the system, of the heavily flawed system, and within the confines of the city. Finally, we have the principal, who is new to the school and stretched very thin. Although the principal says they care about ending bullying, they aren't really going about it the right way. They aren't getting to the root of the issue. So in this case, the principal is the OIG, who lacks resources and don't seem to be truly getting to the root of the problem of policing in Seattle, especially considering they're stretched so thin. They have to, review the entire system, just like a principal has to, take care of the entire school, every department. And so that's our analogy. Again, it lacks a bit of nuance, especially considering an important piece of the puzzle is that all these bodies are, at the end of the day, purely advisory, and SPD gets to decide whether to implement these recommendations or not. So in this case, it would be as if, even if, the counselor and the teacher and the principal finally get together and say, you know what, we have to put an end to this bully. This is getting ridiculous. Let's expel him. It'd be as if the bully could say, you know what, no, I would rather not get bullied or get expelled. Like, I'll stay here. And so that's kind of how ridiculous it is, and how structural flaw the system has that the bully can just decide that he doesn't want to get expelled. And so that's kind of our simple analogy for what these accountability systems actually do, and how they're ineffective, and kind of the structural and systemic flaw behind that. So next slide.
All right, so again, we appreciate all of you for coming to our presentation and really listening to everything that we had to say. Also dealing with the trolls that decided to come and mess around. They're always fun. So we appreciate everyone for being here. And we hope that throughout this presentation, we have shed a light on the complicated system of the police accountability in Seattle. SGPA is actively working towards ensuring more community involvement in Seattle's accountability system, and education on the current system is an important part of that. If you would like to get involved in the work that we do, we invite you to check out our website and our social media. We do post a lot more educational content on there, as well as we post things that we're working towards, and towards the defund and restructuring the accountability system. So we invite you all to go and check out our social medias. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We also have a website. It's on there on the bottom right. And then, if you guys have any questions, we do have the time. We have about 10 minutes for any questions. You guys can start loading in the chat any questions that you may have. If we haven't made some things clear, or if you want to know a bit more. If not, then we do appreciate everyone for joining. And be on the lookout for more live streams that we do have in the future. So thank you all for being here.
All right, so like I said, so it's just some Q&As right about now. The chat is no longer disabled, so if anyone is having trouble sending some of those questions, now is the time to send those through, and we'll just see what comes up.
All right, so it looks like we have a question. So the first one, what are ways that we can help with holding the police and these groups accountable? I mean, that's kind of what our group is trying to figure out. It's obviously really complicated, and it will take, a long time, and it will take kind of getting at the root of these issues and dismantling the structures that currently exist. But something we can do is kind of make sure that that there are community voices in these discussions that are happening around accountability. So, for example, the contract that we mentioned multiple times is coming up for renegotiation. And so we want to make sure that if this contract between the police guild and the city is being renegotiated, and since last time it caused all these issues for accountability, we want to make sure that there's a community voice within those negotiations. So again, it's really complicated, but getting kind of community in the discussions and these negotiating tables is what's really important in this case.
And kind of going off of that, we're gonna have our own separate live stream, looking into the contract itself, because there's, like she's saying, there's just so much that goes on with that. But what we've learned from this process and from these last couple months of really preparing for this live stream and just contract negotiations that are about to begin is that there's a lot of this is face value. And I mean that in a sense where you have to kind of dig deeper and look further into the information in order to really be able to assess, is it effective or not. When I just began all this and I was like, well, how are police being held accountable, or whatever the case is, I didn't know what an OPA was. But I'm like, oh, sweet, we have an entire office dedicated to holding the police accountable. Great. It's not a part of SPD. But then, like Julie says, you find out that the vast majority of the officials investigators are police officers, and they can investigate all the serious acts of misconduct that people generally care about. And so it's not until we all take that opportunity and to just educate ourselves, and that's what SGPA is trying to do, is because not everyone has the time to sit and read a 60-page contract. But just one thing to look out for is, like I said, contract negotiations are about to begin at the end of this year. And before these contracts are ratified and they're passed and set in stone, there's about a month at least where the contract goes out to the public, and the city council, the mayor, they have a public hearing about these contracts. And they have, and this is our chance as well to speak on that issue. And what happened last time is we missed that opportunity because it happened under the radar. So we're just trying to make sure that that doesn't happen again as well.
And then for the question about the what elected offices have power over this beyond the mayor and the city council, that's a really good question. A lot of these bodies, the like directors and all these things are appointed by the mayor and the city council. And so there actually isn't, we probably have to do a bit more research into it, but from what we can tell, there isn't actually that much of like elections going on. It's really just appointments from the mayor and the city council. So really the mayor and the city council are definitely the key elected players when it comes to accountability. And that's kind of obviously a major issue if those bodies have such a huge influence on these accountability bodies, especially when, as we've seen, especially with the mayor, there doesn't seem to be an interest in truly achieving police accountability. So we really want to make sure, again, that that the community is getting a chance to really have a say in these accountability bodies. And then, oh yeah, so the question about the Community Police Commission is public but doesn't allow public comment. Are any of these bodies actually public? Yeah, so again, yeah, so it doesn't allow for public comment as of now, which is, you know, an issue. The meetings are open to the public. They happen every Wednesday at 9. So if you do want to sit in, I would highly recommend. They are pretty informative, but you cannot make public comment. The other bodies, as far as being kind of open to the public, aren't. The OIG has held 1 or 2 public forums, but other than that, there isn't a whole lot of space at all for community input. With the OPA, all these investigations are pretty hush-hush. I mean, it's the investigative body, and not a whole lot of information goes out until the investigation is completed and they release their investigation. So if you are interested, I would just recommend looking these bodies up and seeing what material they put out. They do put out pretty great material, especially the CBC puts out some informative material. But yeah, I wouldn't consider, other than the CBC, I wouldn't really consider any of the other bodies public.
And also, just to add on to that as well, so with the CPC, like she was saying, they don't currently take public comment, but that's actually something that they're working on and like trying to address currently. But one thing we've noticed is, because we've been going to these CPC meetings for at least the last month, and initially it never even was brought up in conversation. It never really came up. And then, people started to come, people started to ask questions, people started to ask, how does the Community Police Commission not listen to the community by taking public comment? And that kind of lit a fire under their ass, basically. And now it's something that they're vocalizing, they're actively addressing. And, within the next month or so, then they should be expected to actually open back up for public comment, because they did at one point. And so it just shows like how important it is to, these meetings are like, they're held over Zoom right now. So like CPC's at 9 a.m. And I mean, no one likes waking up at 9 a.m. If you don't have to, but I mean, if you're chilling Wednesday morning, then just join a Zoom meeting. Or if you can't, you can at least send an email. And I also just want to add, just because we're talking about the police contract, but in the chat, I'm sending a website right now. It's called checkthepolice.org. And basically it's just a really simple website that kind of breaks down different police contracts and really talks about what different limitations they put. And you can also see it in comparison to other countries, I mean, not countries, but other cities across the nation. And you'll find that Seattle has one of the most problematic contracts in the nation.
Okay, well, it is about 8 p.m. So this is the end of our live stream. But once again, we really do appreciate everyone for being present and being here and watching it with us, and being the first of the firsts with us. So thank you again. And once again, check out our social medias. Join us. We're always looking for more volunteers. Whether you like, I don't know, we have outreach, we have research, we have writers, all of it. So if you guys are interested in wanting to join this this movement, we really would appreciate you guys to reach out to us and join us. Other than that, thanks everyone. See you guys again at the next one.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.